This is another iRaw podcast.
Hello, I'm Amelia Lease, and welcome to Season 4 of Think Like a Vegan, a companion podcast to my book entitled Think Like a Vegan, which is also available in paperback and audiobook. My guest today is Altamush Saeed, who is working tirelessly in Pakistan for animals and people. One of the things he focuses on is disasters, and he will change how you view them as more than just terrible things that randomly happen. What Altamush is doing in Pakistan is absolutely remarkable, and I urge you to follow his work. Welcome, Altamush. I'm so glad you're joining me today. It's really great to see you. How are you?
I'm good. I'm so happy to be here talking about things I love. We love, actually. So it's a good space to talk about them and hopefully move the conversation forward.
I'm really looking forward to it. I've been looking forward to it since the first time I heard you speak. Before we hear from Altamush, I want to tell you a little bit about him. He has 3 master's degrees from U.S. law schools, one in animal law, one in environmental law, and one in human rights international law. He's put all of that to work when he returned to Pakistan, founding an NGO called Charity Doings Foundation Pakistan, which helps people, animals, and the environment. And he'll tell us about that in a lot of detail later in this episode. And he also founded the first animal and environmental law and research think tank in Pakistan, which provides free animal law legal aid. And he makes the connection between Islam and animal rights. We don't get into that here in this episode, but you can find his work on that in his social media, which I'll link to in the show notes. Altamush is a force of nature in the best way. Altamush, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to talk about today about animals and disasters, which is something, a topic that is becoming mainstream day by day. But of course, we are not, as human beings, we live in a post-humanist world. We live in a very anthropocentric setting. It's really hard for us to see animals even as victims of disasters. But that is something that is changing. However, just like how societies work, we often think about those things when it's already too late. We shouldn't do that in this situation because disasters is something that connects all of us. It's not just animals, it's human beings, it's the environment, it's everything coming together. And it's actually the last stage of climate change, in my opinion, because right now the global conversation is around climate change and how it's affecting everybody. But I think we need to move the conversation one step forward and talk about disasters, because it's no longer climate change. It was 10, 15 years ago, but now it's the age of disasters. And that is something we should all be, concerned about, because it affects all of us, not just animals. And particularly talking about animals and disasters is important because they have very special roles in preventing disasters, during disasters, and after disasters as well. And from a very animalistic perspective, they do have the inherent right to be protected from it because they didn't cause it. I think that's really, really important. So globally, when we think about disasters, it falls under the United Nations Office of Disaster Risk Reduction. And there are a few non-binding soft law instruments that regulate them, and there is a history behind it. And just to flag one thing, we don't have internationally any treaty that's legally binding when it comes to disasters. So we have these domestic frameworks that exist across the world. And as we can understand, actually all of them, except very, very few, are only about human beings. But there are some flaws there as well, which further exacerbate the problems animals suffer. But at the same time, humans suffer more as well, which is something really interesting or weird, actually, for me as an expert to understand. So the era of disasters, actually, and the whole conversation started around in the 1980s. this was when disasters, had started to come up and people wanted to see what would happen. So in the 1990s, which was basically labeled as the decade of disasters, that is when essentially conversations started to happen, which was after the Rio Summit in 1992, or the World Summit that we normally call it as. Even though at that point we had climate change frameworks, because that was the kind of conversation that was moving forward, and we were still at the sustainable development stage, which is basically a kind of like a battle between environmentalism and development. And as a result of environment taking a backseat, climate change happens. Everybody in the environment sector suffers, which includes humans and the animals. So that is when these conversations had started to happen. In Japan, there were a few earthquakes and tsunamis, that had taken prominent notice, which eventually led to development of certain frameworks. The first one that was developed in 2005 was the Hugo framework, which essentially was non-binding because, a big problem with disasters, and I want to make that clarified, is that nobody wants to take responsibility. Because if you take responsibility for disasters, that means you have to take action. And that is something the international community or even the local community is something unwilling to take. So the conversation has always been about climate change, which is something, which is a framing that we have to change. And this was, I would say, the goal behind these instruments, because if you look at international treaty making, which I'm sorry, I'm making this so boring, but generally before people take responsibility, it always starts with a non-binding instrument where the conversation is moved forward, eventually to, create something that's legally binding. But even though we don't have that yet, we hope we will, because it's otherwise going to be too late. So this Hugo framework came into being, and it talked about a few principles like vulnerability, resilience, and a few other things, which were something that was adopted by the world. And many countries after 2005 developed their own national disaster frameworks. As I'm talking about Pakistan, I will talk about that, and I've studied about the U.S. disaster framework as well, so I will briefly touch that as well. And I've written on this topic too. So in 2006, unfortunately, Hurricane Katrina happened, which is important for animals at the very least, because this was a kind of a tsunami flood disaster that happened in the US, and this eventually led to a lot of devastation. But what really happened inside for animals was that a few people, especially in the South, where this happened in the Louisiana area, they were unwilling to leave their homes. They were unwilling to leave their animals behind. And given the history of animal rights movements, we also have to be, critical of how they start. They always start with those animals that are the closest to people. That's how it is. We can't change that. And we have to move forward. We have to be very strategic about it. So these people were unwilling to leave their pets behind. And a lot had died. A lot of pets had died, around 250,000, which is really, really bad. And that eventually, led to these people who were just unwilling to leave their homes. And eventually that led to a new legislation, which is called the Emergency Transportation Act for Pets, essentially, or the Pets Act in the US in 2006. And I will be, of course, I have to be honest. So I will, of course, say why the act was made. It did help animals, but the act originally was made to make sure that human beings don't die because they are unwilling to leave disaster zones. Again, anthropocentric, but still we have to use these arguments. We have to be very critical about it, but we have to be very strategic. So maybe the same argument can work elsewhere because the animal doesn't care. It just needs to be saved. Because I think that's a strategy that has been, currently being applied across the world. So the US, fortunately, unfortunately, without reasons for animal protection, was the first country in the world to have this, minutely worded protection for animals, that they need to be, some protocols under the US framework for emergency management, that animals, especially pets, should have a safe space where they can, leave with their human beings as well, because the human beings would be unwilling to leave them. I think that's very powerful. I think that's something we need to acknowledge and appreciate, because it was because of those people that we eventually had this act. And given, we are still in the early stages of the movement building, globally at the very least, this was a very important step. Then eventually other countries followed suit as well. But of course, a phenomenon like this didn't happen elsewhere. So most of their disaster prevention acts were mostly limited to human beings. Talking about Pakistan, we had our first National Disaster Management Act in 2010. Again, I'll be very critical. The only reason we made that was because the Hyogo framework mandated that if any country wants funding, they need to have their own legislation. So that's why they did it. They didn't even care about human beings, in my perspective. But of course, that's making it too critical. But global South countries have other problems. But still, this was really interesting, and a lot of people don't know about it. So this act eventually started with the basics, of course, protecting human beings, and kind of that's it. But there were some other major flaws as well. Given that we don't have any international framework that's legally binding, most of the frameworks that exist around the world around disaster prevention are also hinged on that criteria that, we didn't cause the disaster, therefore we shouldn't be responsible to prevent it as well. So therefore, most of the strategy that we see inside these disaster prevention acts, not prevention, disaster management, they don't ever call it prevention, is that once the disaster happens, then we'll do something about it. So which is weird and interesting and stupid, because you have lost so much that you will never recover from. And, no matter what happens, even if it's a human being, from a very human level, the person who has lost their roof, no matter how much you compensate them, they will never be fully made whole. And that's at a human level, which is bizarre. And that is something the whole world does. So everybody should be accountable. And of course, animals are not part of it. They are in different ways, and which I'm going to touch now, because we frame these conversations from a very humanistic perspective. So they're referred to as livelihood. That's the word they use for animals, because that's where we jump the conversation to farm animals, and they are almost always dubbed as livelihood or property or assets. And that is something, if you want to protect them, they will be protected because the human being is losing something, not the animal itself, which is another thing I know a lot of people know about, but I think it's right there in the language, and we should, accept it. Not in a way, of course, as an animal rights person or an activist, but use it for advancing our own strategies, because it's okay if the language is like that. But if you can at least improve protections of livelihood mechanisms, which do not exist at this point, perhaps you can save more farm animals or other animals in general. And that's okay, because the animal at the end of the day does not care. It just wants to be protected. So that happened. And of course, that is still the current law in my country. And eventually these disaster management acts popped up across the world. So from a very, strategic or legal or scientific perspective, at the very least, there are 4 stages in disasters. Number 1, of course, is the prevention stage, which is, where it all starts. And that is something where action has to be taken. Then, of course, it's after the disasters happen, you have to take a response stage. And then, of course, after that, there's a rehabilitation stage, which is eventually where you take actions to prevent future disasters. There is a 4th stage as well, which is kind of like a mixture of the rehabilitation phase and things, or, some policies or legal developments that you make essentially before even the disaster can be conceived. So it's a bit before prevention, because it's more about rehabilitation and building policies. For example, to make this, more contextual, is that there are some nations in the world that have policies around housing codes, for example, should not be built in areas where they're disaster prone. So if that happens, or if there are some, policies around as well, that the material that you use should be earthquake proof, for example. Seems common knowledge for now, but there are many countries in the world that don't even have that. So for merely economic reasons, for profits, developers are willing to develop these, spaces near rivers or that are, flood prone just because people want to live close to a river or, build one, which is insane, which is something that's currently going on in Pakistan. So there is a development authority that's trying to build a housing society against a river that does not even exist. So they're going to pump water from within the city, which is polluted, and then they're going to create this natural river, which I don't know how it's going to work. It's going to be a flood zone because flood zones change over time as well, which is something humans cannot control. So it's a complete environmental disaster, mostly for economic reasons. And the whole debate, again, then, jumps backward towards this idea between sustainable and development. And I think we need to move forward because there, at some stages, because sustainable development implies that there will be development. There is never going to be that stage where, you say, okay, let's not build it. That never happens. That's never part of the word, how it's defined. It's basically about preserving, resources for current and future generations. But it never says that don't do it. And those principles eventually have flown into other principles. And one of them is actually really important, which is the precautionary principle. It's a part of international environmental law, and it's also part of disaster frameworks as well, because if you're going to develop something, you need to have an initial environmental assessment where you basically see if there is a potential risk of some kind of environmental issue happening, or even because if you prevent that, you're essentially going to prevent a disaster as well. Because, taking these actions at the local level or before something really happens is something you can use to prevent disasters. However, the precautionary principle only gets triggered when a risk has been identified. And after that, you don't have to, completely eliminate the risk if the marginal cost for eliminating that risk is too high. You don't have to do it. What you have to do is make sure that the risk that can be eliminated in monetary terms, that's doable, actually, is something that's all you have to do. So it's very cost oriented, which really means that, you don't have to prevent the project in itself. So this precautionary principle only gets activated when there's a risk, and you don't have to eliminate complete risk. All you have to do is eliminate a portion of the risk, which is something that's cost intensive or cost oriented. So what that really means is that the project eventually moves forward, and there are some inherent risks that you're saying, okay, let's leave it at there and let them happen. And that's a kind of like a very big flaw in the precautionary principle. But still, I'm so happy that it exists, because before this, you could just literally do anything, and so we have to understand that disaster management or disaster laws are a part of this big environmental regime, and the environmental regime is very weak because the people who don't want this to be very strongly developed are the developers, are those who have economic interests, strong economic interests, because that's another part of the conversation that always happens. But this is where it gets tricky and interesting, is that given the way we are moving forward, we will lose a certain part of our GDP, which is economics. We will lose our yield. We will lose the ability to produce more food. We will lose the ability to have more arable land. We will lose the ability to even have the basic resources. And so for a country like mine, Pakistan, we will lose 1/4 of our GDP by 2030. 1/4 is a huge number. And that is something that's similar for other global South nations as well, which is something, they should be very, very concerned about. And I think they should be, moving towards earning money. It's okay, but more towards scientifically, proven mechanisms or systems that would ensure that you solve the human problems as well. We solve, earn money at it, and you also prevent mechanisms from existing that will eventually take away that money in the first place. So think from a very humanistic perspective, even that would help a lot of animals.
We'll pause for another fabulous soundscape by Matthew Gerstenberger, after which we'll return with more from Altamush Saeed. This is Ofusa Furin. We're back for the second part of Altamush Saeed's discussion about animals in disasters.
So after the Hubergo framework, we actually had another framework that was developed under the United Nations Office of Disasters Reduction, which is the Sendai framework that came into being in 2015, which I know is, I'm still boring everybody, but it does exist and we need to use it. It again further talked about certain specific terms. Again, livelihood was mentioned, assets were mentioned, property was mentioned, because that's how they, include animals in the system as well. And that's mostly for farm animals. Because they have this humanistic value attached to it. But of course, then they talk about three other very important principles. One of them is vulnerability. Number two is resilience. And actually, those two are more important at this point. So resiliency actually means your ability to, be more prepared towards disasters. And that only happens if we have these building codes or some kind of policies at the back end that ensure that you will, not be in a situation where a disaster will have a higher significant impact on your population. Then, of course, it's vulnerability. Vulnerability is that, for example, you belong to a space where, technology is not available. There is no early warning systems available, meaning you will never know when a disaster is coming, or meaning you will never have the time to evacuate prospectively. So those kind of things were further elevated in this framework. It's still non-binding. Interestingly, this framework came into 2015 alongside the UN Sustainability Development Goals as well, which although do not talk about disasters, they do talk about climate change, they do talk about life on land, they do talk about life on underwater as well, which is animals. But of course, it's still very, very, a very weak framework, because I think there should be another SDG inside it, which is no animal exploitation. But of course, that's too utopian. And a lot of people are working on it. I was too at some point. Because the thing is, the way this current framework works, it's too weak to ensure that you're even preventing disasters, which is going against humans, animals, and the environment. And that has, kind of taken center stage. However, when you talk about the data from the Office of United Nations Disasters Reduction, they say that by 2030, we will have at least 560 disasters happening across the world. And over 37.5 million people will go under extreme poverty. They don't talk about animals in this statement, but given the current stage of the world, we don't have, even close to 100 disasters per year, but we're still suffering at a stage where it's becoming unrecoverable. And for Pakistan, which is something that happened in 2022, when a flood struck us, and just to, for the audience to know, 1/3 of Pakistan was underwater in August and September, apologies for that, in 2022. And that led to a lot of devastation. There was data taken out from the NDMA, the Pakistan Disaster Management Authority, which said that over, 1,700 people had died, over 12,000 people suffered injuries, and over 33 million people were displaced. They also shared another interesting piece of data, which is again, of course, linked to the human, property framework. They said that over 1.1 million farm animals, the term they used for livestock, but I don't like to use it, 1.1 million farm animals died. And that was the date. The only reason that data existed was because it had a human value. People had lost something. And of course, just like the US, Pakistan also has this indemnification program, which I think is actually causing more disasters, and is anti-animal protection as well, because in the US, this LIP program essentially states that insurances will be given to farmers, for every piece of animal that dies, which is essentially incentive for let the animal die and escape. Which is why when floods or, other kind of issues happen at factory farms, which is a concentrated animal feeding operation, people have, zero incentive of leaving creating some kind of escape mechanism for their animals to leave. However, of course, there are some mandates that, these escape mechanisms should exist. They're highly impractical because it is, of course, not in their interests, because they will eventually be paid. And this kind of funding in the US is in the millions. In Pakistan, of course, it's much, much lower, but it still does exist, which is kind of like an incentive for people to let their animals die. Of course, I understand the idea behind this was to ensure that human beings, are, in a safe space. But for many of these human beings, these animals have, this very important bond. And I have seen in the disaster work I did in 2022 in Pakistan, where we not only rescued human beings, we rescued animals as well. For human beings, of course, we built around 500 indigenous houses. We had over 25 plus medical gynae camps because there are over 600,000 pregnancies happening in that zone. And of course, women have a very important role. So we try to fill that as well. And at the same time, we provided them cooked food as well, which initially, of course, I hope you understand, was not vegan, but later it was made vegan because, I'm the only person at this organization who was, vegan and understand those things. So I had to make that environmental argument that the food system is the one that's caused these disasters. So why are we, adding more fire to it? And that's when they agreed. So we went fully vegan afterwards, all our food drives. And since then, we are a national vegan organization in Pakistan called Charity Doings Foundation. And eventually for human beings, we started this very new novel idea of having a disaster zone farm animal shelter, which is now operational since last year. And there we actually rescued 8,000 farm animals in the flood zones. And eventually afterwards, when the disaster zone farm animal shelter facility was created, we had space for 500 farm animals, to be kept safe. And the idea was that if another disaster happens, we would have some kind of a space where we can take some actions. We're not a government level organization, so it's a small facility, but still it's the first one in our country. And I think perhaps the world as well, because we have, we don't have a space where it's dedicated for animal protections and acknowledging that animals can be victims of disasters as well, which is really, really important. So we did both of those things, and we are currently, trying to work on legislation through litigation, which is another venture that I recently started 2 years ago called Environmental Animal Rights Consultants Pakistan, which is basically the first animal and environmental law firm in Pakistan and a research think tank. We have been very actively working in courts. We have been working on pets, like banning dog culling, which we did. We won the case in January of this year and officially legally banned dog culling in the province of Punjab. But of course, the implementation is a problem. So we're filing lots of cases, filed another one just yesterday. And we work on, protecting bears, dancing bears particularly. We saved one and now it's in sanctuary. We have another case this Monday against a circus that has illegally kept wild animals, which is, of course, another environmental issue as well, because these animals can get diseased. And given COVID-19 happened, we need to take some precautions where private people do not keep these animals. And it's, of course, illegal. So we don't have to get into the emotional side of things. It's just illegal. You can't do it. So we're working on those things, and we are working on a new petition for protection of, or at least the inclusion of animals in disasters. And the framework we're, going to use is, of course, about protecting human beings, because that's how it works. And we're going to talk about the food system, for example, because that's really, really important. Another petition that we're working on legally, which will eventually formulate the first environmental friendly food system policy for my country, which is, again, if you link food system to disasters, is that many of us don't know, but 1/3 of our greenhouse gas emissions come from the food system. 70% of those come from animal agriculture, because animals produce an insane amount of manure in the tubs and produce an insane amount of methane as well, which has at least 128 times more global warming potential than carbon dioxide, which is kind of our metric for measuring greenhouse gas emissions. Then, of course, the food system is also responsible for 80% of the eutrophication, which is basically the water getting contaminated and populated and filled of these hormones that are, not good for the aquatic environment. And of course, lots of other things. And one of them is we use 50% of the global agriculture land on food systems, many of which is now going into animal agriculture system, which are an environmental nightmare for the people. But of course, and they are the reasons why we have these disasters. And for Pakistan particularly, there was research that took place in 2022 in UK at the Imperial College London, where they said that while we cannot fully pinpoint what was the actual cause of those those floods and rains, what they did predict that it was cause of global warming and the temperature rise that happened. And if you make the connection between the greenhouse gas emissions that come from these food systems and you connect it with the global rise in temperatures, that was actually the cause why the floods happen in Pakistan. And that is something that's, becoming common knowledge across the world as well. But of course, the governments are unwilling to take some strategic action on it, is because then they will have to take responsibility to prevent disasters, which is something they should do in the first place. They would not lose their GDP, people would not go homeless, and the animals will also survive. So it's in the best interest. But the thing is, when you take responsibility for preventing disasters, you're also taking responsibility that you caused the disasters. That is something nobody is willing to do. And of course, that's an argument that will take time. But of course, me, on the other hand, I'm working on the food system side of things, developing this policy as a mechanism to attract more climate finance for Pakistan, which is in the government's interest, but at the same time, moving, more climate finance into food systems, into developing green food systems where it's better for everybody. And scientifically speaking, this is going to solve the food security problem in my country as well. So I'm hoping for a very good result. But at the other side of things, direct inclusion of animals in disasters is very, very important for these reasons, but of course for their intrinsic protection as well. And that is an argument that we are, constantly trying to move forward. That is kind of what's happening across the world. There are some other nations other than the US that have some protections. New Zealand is trying for it. Right now, they've not been successful, but they're also moving the same argument about the human-animal bond, that people will be unwilling to leave disaster zones. Therefore, animals should be protected. And that's still early stage, but at least they're trying. Indonesia has some protections. India has some protections on animals in disaster, but of course, because without the ability or without the policy of preventing disasters, those kind of protections are not that helpful. You can of course work with the government to help train them on veterinary support on how to rescue or protect animals in disasters, which is a new project we will be starting with this year with the government of Pakistan. But it's still a jumbled up system. Priorities are not state. And as a result, not just animals, but human beings are suffering as well. And in this conversation, the absence of food system is disastrous. And I can quote this for a fact because I attended the United Nations Office of Disasters Reduction Ministerial Conference in Philippines last year. And it was, it had people from across the Asia Pacific. I can say this without a doubt because I was there. There was not a single session on food system and disasters there at the entire conference for 5 days, which is, shows of how inefficient or how our priorities are misaligned. So that's kind of where I will stop, and let me know what else I can share.
Well, you're doing incredible work, and it's fascinating, it's thought-provoking, it's heart-wrenching, and maddening at the same time. It's infuriating. I mean, an entire conference, 5 days, not a single food system. I mean, that's just mind-blowing. So thank you for everything that you're doing, and thank you for talking about animals in disaster and everything that's going on in Pakistan, and also giving an overview, which I think is also really important, of what's happening in the U.S. and elsewhere. And a couple of things that always strikes me is animals as property, and people don't twig on that. They don't. They're not familiar with that. They don't realize that every single animal, we have decided that every single animal, whether they are wild living, whether they are domesticated, quote unquote, whether they are companion animals, are farmed animals, they are considered property. So they're either property of an individual as a natural person, or a corporate entity, or a government entity, or the actual state itself. And so whoever decides, whatever happens to that that property, that thing, that they have no inherent right. Like my phone does not have an inherent right to existence. And that is a huge issue. But I think and I'm really glad you brought it up, because that concept is so important and so often overlooked that it really, I think it provides people with it's sort of a foundational revelation, if you will, about how we organize ourselves and our societies. So I'm really glad you are focusing on that as well. And I want to talk about. I want to go back to. Well, first, before I even ask you more questions, just talk a little bit more about the charity you founded, which is called Charity Doings. Talk a little bit more about that and what you're doing right now.
Yeah, of course. And just to add in a new project that I recently started 2 years ago. So I'm also going to talk about my my law firm as well, because it's something that eventually flowed from it, and both of them are important. So I will start with Charity Doings Foundation. So this is something we started in 2016. This was not registered at that point, but we were essentially working on human beings, because I'm just going to be honest, that's kind of the story of my life. We only saw human suffering at that point. And that's, kind of like a natural truth for people in Pakistan, because coming from a very underdeveloped economy, that's something, everybody sees. And I think that's okay. That's good. At least they're putting some empathy, into the space out there. But eventually in 2018, I was rescued by a cat. The cat that you listen to is her child. So that's kind of how my story started. And that cat is sleeping, so I'm not going to wake her up. But her name was Mao, and she came into our life. And, at that point, I didn't know what spay neuter meant at all. So she went out, came back pregnant, gave birth to these 5 babies who live with us now. And Mao has taught me about more animals than everybody on the planet. So I've been, always thinking about how animals are part of the system. And that is eventually when we started our animal rights or welfare projects at that point as well. And to quote one of those projects is that eventually we built these water projects, which were essentially for human beings before, but now they're for both humans and animals since that point. So what we do is we kind of use gravity, and whatever the leftover water is, it eventually goes to a pond. It stays there for 5 minutes and eventually goes back to the water table. So nothing is lost, not even a drop. And both humans and animals, benefit from it as well. The project itself is carbon neutral because environmental values are very important to us. And now what we're doing is we are diverting that same water to build these beautiful green vegetable gardens as well, alongside those water projects. So we have built some of them in the middle of deserts as well. We have built them actually across the country. So right now we have 1,600 of these water projects, and eventually we're going to transform every single one of them to have these green vegetable gardens. That's essentially veganism, but essentially what it's trying to do is create an ecosystem where food security is addressed, where environmental footprint is the lowest possible, where animals are outside of the food system, and both animals and human beings have an outlet for water, which is, I would say, life. And eventually, because droughts are another, frequent phenomenon in Pakistan, which is another disaster, these water projects are the very reason why these people and animals survive. So that's really, really important. That's just one of our projects. We, of course, have another project on solar electricity provision for people. We have another large-scale project in the health sector where we are running a diagnostic center facility which offers free tests of any kind in Balochistan, which is kind of like our most underdeveloped province. And the major beneficiary of those projects are, of course, women, because the concept of women hygiene is actually inexistent at that point in that place. So it's really, really important for them. And of course, just to mention again, our water projects also benefit women a lot as well, because it is kind of, traditional responsibility for them to collect water. Now they don't have to anymore, because before this, their journey was in miles. Now it's just right outside their doorsteps, which is something really, really important. And to just, connect it to disasters again, women are actually very important in disaster management prevention, because they're actually more closer to the animals. They're more closer to the children. They're more closer to the elderly. And, benefiting them, empowering them, and making them center stage is kind of really, really important if you want to do any disaster management programs, which is something we do on the ground. So, and then we, of course, have a TB, a tuberculosis project that we're recently starting. We work on diabetes as well for children mostly because there's a lot of lack of education there as well. And if children don't get their their insulin shot, they will die. That's really important. Then, of course, we support a school for special children. That's another project that somebody else does. We're just supporting them, which is kind of very important. And and we do tree plantations on a massive scale, mostly of fruit-bearing trees, because that helps people with food as well and gives shade and is better for the environment as well. We are very major players in disaster management issues that happen in Pakistan. There was one flood that happened last year in August where we rescued animals in large numbers by providing them food and emergency veterinary support. And of course, in 2020, when COVID happened, we worked across the country. And eventually, when the floods happened as well, we worked across the country, but this time for both humans and animals. And eventually, environment also became a very major part of our work as well. So to define our work, we work on interspecies justice because we believe we want to make the world a better place for all life, humans, animals, and the environment. And eventually, at this point, I was, in some part of my life, I was in the US. And eventually, I came back last year full time to work in Pakistan. And I ended up in master's in law in each of these disciplines separately. So I have a master's in human rights international law from the University of Michigan. I have a master's in animal law from Lewis and Clark. And I have another master's in environmental law from Lewis and Clark as well. That did not happen. I would say it was divine. It just happened. And I'm so glad, to be working on those things before I even got those degrees. And I wanted to do something in Pakistan. So before I came back, I founded Environmental Animal Rights Consultants Pakistan as well, which is, as I mentioned before, the first ever animal and environmental law firm and research think tank in Pakistan, through which we work on litigation. We represent people for free, essentially. So we do free animal legal aid, which is a bizarre concept for Pakistan.
That's amazing.
And it's highly financially draining. I have to use my own money now. I'm looking for funding, which is maybe this space will help me because I need to make sure that it's free because the animals don't pay and the environment doesn't pay. And if I wait for money, then they're going to die. And that is something I cannot do.
Yeah.
So through this law firm, we have filed over 13 to 14 cases since November of last year. We won a case against a zoo, which led to its further, I would say, development, but not something we wanted. And we're going to go to court again to see how the animals are doing inside the system. We have banned dog culling in Punjab, which was a case that, was in the courts for 9 years. We got another judgment that ensures the implementation of the same policy and to properly ensure that dog culling doesn't happen. We filed another case yesterday on dog culling against because the government is refusing to listen to the court. So we have to go again and again and again and again. And that's very financially cost intensive, but we have to do it. We're going to keep at it. We saved a bear through a petition as well, and now it's safe in a sanctuary. And we filed a case against a circus as well that was illegally keeping wild animals. Now we're planning something on animals and disasters, the food system. Those are kind of like our incoming cases. And at the same time, we're helping people register complaints against animal abuse locally, because that's how we move the system forward there as well. Because shockingly, there has been no, major precedent of animal abuse in my country that I'm trying to develop. Then, of course, on the education side of things, I have taught animal law in Pakistan. I've taught international animal law. I've also taught international disaster law. And right now I'm teaching environmental law at NUST Law School. And I'm writing a curriculum on environmental law for my entire country, which has a submodule of animal law as well, on disasters, on food systems, and other topics that we have not discussed in depth. So if that happens, it's going to be revolutionary. And hopefully it will happen. I'm also working on something called training environmental judges as well, because if the judges don't know the law, or at least the scientific side of things, how are they going to give judgments? So I'm working on that too. And on education, I recently trained faith-based leaders in Islam, because that's a huge part of our community in Pakistan. And we train them on human, animal, and environmental rights, and we help them develop these Friday sermons. And as Ramadan is going on, one of them actually delivered their sermon, and I have that in recording, which I'm going to put on social media to help people understand that even Islam is directly connected to these principles. And that is something we're trying to develop. So education for different people at different levels, litigation. I've written laws as well, and some of them have been seen by these government officials. So maybe that will move forward the conversation. And animal rights protection as well. And we're constantly going to court and just, being there for the people. And officially, people think, I'm Pakistan's animal rights lawyer, which happened really, really fast. So I'm happy about it. But there's so much to do, and we are, that's why when we started this podcast, I said I'm trying to do something. So maybe it will happen because I can't wait for the next generation. I'm just going to do it right now and then hopefully become obsolete. Because that's also my other goal, to build movements where we are no longer needed to lead them. That's kind of, my hidden agenda. So I am...
That's key. That's key. We that's exactly right. We should be building in our own obsolescence, because that is the point. That is exactly the point. The point is no longer to use animals.
Yeah.
And that benefits everyone at every level and in every being.
And this one last thing I wanted to share was I recently organized my country's first ever International Animal Environmental Rights Conference, which was a major success that happened in January on the 18th of 19th. We had judges from the Supreme Court, including Justice Athar Minullah, who wrote the famous Kavan judgment, which I'm hoping you have read, and because many people across the world have. And this basically judgment declared that animals are sentient, they have their own rights, and a whole zoo was shut down on the concept of that animals should not be given and be kept in prison cells. So he came there. There were other judges from the Supreme Court, including Justice Aisha Malik, who was key figure in development of the animal birth control policy for Punjab for dogs. We had another sitting judge, Justice Jawad Hassan, who is right now leading, these developments in the environment sector, in the animal rights sector, for their, close development. And then we had people, including the former chairman of the Pakistan National Disaster Management Authority. We had international speakers from across the world, from PETA, from Humane World for Animals. We had 4PAWS International, Dr. Amir, who is a very key figure in veterinary support for wild animals. We literally had everyone, and I don't know how I did it, but then the media picked it up as well, and everybody in the country has talked about animals as a result of it. This eventually led to another major protest that happened this week, and where we met key government figures. Another conference is coming up next month by another amazing colleague on farm animals, which eventually, will move that conversation forward as well. So it's a fire that started, and I'm glad, I was there. And we're going to have another conference next year. We're going to keep at it. We're going to develop education. We're going to work on litigation, legislation. We're not going to leave anything that, can be possibly done for the protection of not just animals, but the environment and human beings. Because that's who at least I am, and I want to, propagate that. So that's a little bit of what I did.
Exactly. Just a little bit.
Yeah.
Just a little bit.
Yeah.
Yes. I think you have more than 24 hours in your days. You're absolutely formidable. And if I don't know, one of our conversations some time ago, you said something that I thought was really, really lovely. You said we were given the privilege to be vegan.
Yes.
And that brings with it a responsibility. And I thought that was such a endearing sentiment and also really profound, because it's right. There is a responsibility and it is a privilege to have this moment of understanding that is completely changes everything.
Yeah, and I think that's the reason why I'm so good at what I do, because I can only do it. I can never ensure the result. And it's always the animals who are moving the conversation forward. I'm so grateful that they're letting me do this. That's how I always frame it. So it is a privilege for me, because otherwise I would have never known this whole other side of the world. And now, propagating it, being very strategic. Of course, I use very humanistic arguments because that's what the humans being want to listen to. That's okay for me. But the animals are constantly, leading the way, and they're showing me so much. And I take this responsibility to my heart. This is why I'm just, trying to make something happen. I can never ensure the result. because it's always going to be the animals. And it's happening. Weird stuff happens to me all the time.
Well, I hope more weird, good stuff continues to happen, Altamush. Can you tell us, where can people follow your work? Where's the best place? I think, you need to have a giant website with all of your stuff on there.
So yeah, we do have a website for the law firm as well and Charity Doings Foundation. But the easiest way to reach out to me is Instagram, because everybody is, active so much there. I'm on LinkedIn as well, Facebook. Or even WhatsApp, if it develops into something really good, we can work on things, because I'm ready here to file the next petition. Just give me an idea. If it works, I will go to the court. And we're very fast at, how we do things, because as I mentioned before, the basic idea behind free animal legal aid is that the animal must not suffer or die, and you cannot wait for anything to happen. So yeah, you can find me on all my social media channels and my website, but social media is more easier because I'm always there.
Okay, fantastic. Well, again, thank you so much. And I hope more good stuff comes out of all of this. And I know it will, because you're a force to be reckoned with, for sure.
Hopefully. Thank you.
Altamush is such a fine example of finding one's niche in activism. Not only did he find it, but he pretty much created it for himself. We can't all do what he or anyone else does, but we can each do something and organize with others. Learning about what others are doing and imagining the possibilities is fundamental to making change. And I hope this episode has provided some new insight and inspiration.
We tear things up when we go round. We burn things up when we go round. We speed things up when we go round.
That's it from me, Emilise. Thank you for listening. Subscribe to this podcast, share it with others, and leave us a review. Remember, you can get in touch by email at thinklikeaveganbook@gmail.com if you have questions, comments, or want to suggest a guest or a topic for discussion. I'd be happy to hear from you. And you can find more of my work and upcoming events on my website, emilialease.com, and on Substack and on social media. And buy a copy of Think Like a Vegan anywhere you buy books and audiobooks, or request it from your library. Production credit goes to Jim Moore of Bloody Vegans Productions. Theme music provided by Jenny Moore's Mystic Business from the eponymous album. The opening tune is Flashbacks, and we close with Tear Things Up. The interval music is by Matthew Gerstenberger.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.